Welcome, everyone. I'm Sheyna Gifford. I'm joined here by Erik, Antonsen, Elizabeth, Reynolds, Amanda Lippert, and Kevin Duda, all of whom have really excellent and very disparate vantage points on answering questions about maintaining human health during a Mars mission. If you were in the previous talk, it got very granular. Everything from poop to pajamas, crew makeup, trash. We're not going to be talking trash here today, specifically. We're going to be talking about, I'm not going to be talking trash today, specifically. We're going to be talking about some really big ideas, big concepts, things that are sort of more covertly addressed. All of us talk about Mars a lot. We talk about missions a lot, space a lot. But there's some overarching themes that we'd like to address today. And I'd like to ask everyone who will be helping address those to introduce themselves, starting with Kevin at the end of the table.
Yeah, so Kevin Duda, Draper Lab, Senior Program Manager, Space Systems. Been at the lab 16 years, started my career off in the engineering organization, looking at piloted spacecraft and guidance, navigation, and control, flight displays, manual control, GN&C, and before I moved into the program office and took on a little bit of a broader organizational responsibility related to space systems.
I'm Amanda Lippert. I'm a board-certified aerospace physiologist with about 23 years experience in the Navy. I have served with a wide variety of Navy and Marine Corps units to include their weapons schools, and then I was also the first to serve a 2-year fellowship with NASA studying human performance in extreme environments at Johnson Space Center.
I'm Elizabeth Reynolds, Managing Director of Starburst Aerospace. We work with most of the stakeholders in the industry across public and private sector, focused on identifying the best emerging technologies and accelerating integration and adoption in the market. We've historically worked mainly with more traditional aerospace and have started focus heavily on human health in recent years.
My name is Erik Antonsen. I am an associate professor of space medicine and emergency medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. When I was at NASA, I was the element scientist for exploration medical capabilities of the Human Research Program, and I followed that up as an assistant director for human system risk management in the Human Health and Performance Directorate. And now I spend most of my time at the County Trauma Center seeing patients.
All right, so we have an amazing mix, public and private, military, civilian, new emerging technologies, saving lives at the county hospital. So here's a question, and it's going to require a lot of input from a lot of different fields, which is why this panel is so diverse, to answer questions like, in a mission to Mars, whatever duration it is, it will be a great duration, a great distance, and greatly difficult. On such a mission, what are the challenges of maintaining the expeditionary mindset, such that we're on this thing for 1, 2, 3, 4, or longer years? How do we maintain the mindset of we are at work, we have a job to do, and we're doing that job? It's hard enough to maintain it for a 5-day work week. How do we maintain it for the duration and difficulty of a Mars mission? Let's go the other way and start with Erik.
I'm not an expert in this. And I actually wanted to defer this to my panel mates, and then they said, no, you have to actually make an interesting answer up on the spot. So I had the opportunity back in 2016 to do an expedition, a short one, across the Atlantic Ocean on a sailing boat from the Canary Islands to St. Lucia. And we had a crew of 6, and you couldn't sail the boat with less than 5 people, really. It was a big one. The biggest challenges that we ran into in even a short duration mission like that are, one, getting along. We had one crew member who became quite depressed being out in the middle of the ocean for that long, and then he refused to do dishes. And I was like, oh, we all wanted to kill him, right? If you were at some of the earlier sessions, I actually asked a question that was based around a comment from a cosmonaut on Salyut 6, which basically was summed up as, all the ingredients for murder are present in these little cylinders that we're putting people into for short durations, right? What happens when you get to these long duration missions? So I survived my sailing trip. I don't think it was probably quite near the challenge that this is going to be for a Mars mission, but I'm still going to own it, right? But the thing that I find most fascinating about this, and as the risk manager at NASA for the human aspect of things, the biggest challenge that we found was that the engineering culture of the agency was so focused on the admittedly massive challenges of getting there that there was a lot less resources put into how do we live there, how do we stay there, how do we be there. In 2001, the administrator asked the National Academies to weigh in on that, and they published a book that you can still get online for free today called Safe Passage. It laid out what needed to be done for NASA to move to more better balance their engineering mindset with the expeditionary and human aspects of these things. Because throughout these missions, what's going to happen in terms of the actual challenges is that the human body is going to decondition, is the nice way of putting it. And even recently published research on the extensive exercise equipment that's on the ISS has shown that it's not completely counteracting the deconditioning that's occurring. And so when you change that over to a 3-year, a 2-year Mars mission, right? The behavioral health issues, the team challenges, living with people without killing them, the who's going to fix this thing, right? We have 180 people, or up to 80 people in mission control with real-time telemetry from the ISS that are identifying problems, analyzing them, and helping to solve them. You lose comms, and that goes away. So how do the crews make up for these things? And that human system integration is the thread that ties through all of those. How do we make that design that unloads the astronauts enough to allow them to do their job, and meets them where their deconditioning is going? And for me, that intervention is as early as possible, working hand in hand with the engineers for all the other things. So.
For all of these, mission focus is really critical. I think that a focus on analog preparation is also going to be really important, but yes, this is a kind of unknown territory when we're talking about a 3-year mission. And I think that you can break this into a number of different categories, and I think the route to Mars is going to be probably the easiest, because you're looking forward to your execution of your mission there, and there are opportunities to prepare for that mission, and you really are focused on that. I think there are a lot of questions about what work we will be able to do on Mars with this deconditioning that will happen, and how we give people a real purpose other than simply landing their feet. But that's the trip home that I think is going to be the most complicated. And again, the more we can incorporate opportunities for people to continue to find purpose and connection in that, the more successful it will be. But a lot of the countermeasures for these things that we have available today, even the things like contacting family members, really will not exist on these longer missions. I do think that we can focus on, enhancing communication networks, like as we look at some of the satellite networks that are being built or under discussion for cislunar space. Hopefully there will be ways to close some of this gap and to create some of this human connection. And automation of systems will help. The more we can trust the systems to take on some of the really onerous and repetitive tasks and allow humans the time to do human things, I think all of those things will help. But the first mission will also be the hardest. When we talk about third, fourth, fifth mission, the existential threat will have dropped a little bit, assuming everything goes well. And you will be going to a place that potentially has other humans, that potentially has some infrastructure, and it will be a little less challenging. But this first mission is going to be difficult.
Well, I also have been on a few expeditions that involved transiting the Atlantic Ocean a few times in big gray boats that were not nearly as fun as a sailboat. But having the expeditionary mindset is something that I think maybe I have to recognize my bias when I'm talking about this, because with the Navy and with the Marine Corps, that's something that we are kind of conditioned to do from day one. So, we have things in naval aviation, things like there's no such thing as rank in the cockpit, or when you're on the ship, everybody takes out the trash. It doesn't really matter about your rank. And so there's this mindset piece of it that comes with being expeditionary in nature. And while I can chest thump about how amazing the Navy and the Marine Corps are for doing this, what I will say is, a mission to Mars currently, at least for now, is the penultimate litmus for this, right? So you take somebody that has this mindset and this, we're all in this together, there's no such thing as rank, there's no such thing as, you're going to do this and I'm going to do this. We all do it together as a team. It's this team dynamic kind of thing. And I feel like that emphasis is what matters most, and also helps us to approach problems, solve problems differently from a unique perspective. You've only got the tools that are right there with you. Whether you're floating around in the middle of the ocean or you're in space, what you've got is what you've got. So you've got to make things work. When they break, you got to use whatever tools you've got there, whatever brain power you've got there with you. Like was said earlier, you're not going to be able to just kind of radio back to Earth and say, hey, we have this problem. There might be times that you can communicate, or that communication might be delayed, but for time critical things, what you've got is what's right in front of you. And so that expeditionary mindset is something that you can train to, but you have to just kind of live it. You have to do it every day to really kind of take ownership of what that looks and feels like. And so that's my perspective on having an expeditionary mindset for such a critical long duration mission.
Well, the benefit of being last in the question is that everybody's said everything that you want to say. No, I got a couple things. But one of the threads that kind of came through all of this was, the human system integration, the system approach, the system design approach, right? And, when you look at, some of the literature on, psychological aspects of long duration spaceflight and isolation, is you get this third quarter phenomenon that you may have heard about, right? If you break the mission up into quarters, right? You come out of the gate charging like this is awesome. You start to lose a little bit of steam in the second quarter. Third quarter goes to, in a handbasket. And then by the fourth quarter, you're like, oh, I'm almost there. Let's get this. Let's do this, right? So when you think about that overall mission design of, what can you infuse into various parts of that, the mission sequence to maintain a level of morale and performance throughout. So looking at some of the mission designs that were proposed, for going to Mars, and looking at Venus flyby, right? Give the astronauts something to do as part of that Venus flyby. Take some pictures. Be the scientist on board that's going to crunch the data, right? Give them something meaningful to do that they can contribute to the overall mission and the mission success. There's the and then looking at on the way home as well, being able to break it up and keep that morale high and keep performance going. Dave Klaus at Colorado likes to say the things that are important for an astronaut in a spacecraft is keep them healthy, happy, and productive. So can you satisfy all of those tenets? You can keep them healthy. Sure, you got life support, food, toilet. Keep them happy, give them something to do, and then keep them productive. Give them meaningful work that they want to do. A lot of times when we're talking about human automation interaction and levels of automation and the assignment of roles and responsibilities between a human and a robot, we always look and say, okay, well, this is a repetitive task. This should be done by the automation. Well, maybe that's a repetitive task that the human wants to do. Ask them, like, do they have input? Is this something you want to do? You want to have an element in that success, or a hand in that success. So, I guess, looking at, that, maintaining that expeditionary mindset of, making sure you got the roles, responsibilities defined, you've got them something to do, and you're looking ahead and trying to mitigate that third quarter phenomenon.
All right. We've heard a lot about really important things, from meaningful work to maintaining almost a mission first view. Mission first, rank second. And a lot about building systems to offload or maybe onload selectively to keep people engaged. I'm the moderator, so I won't chime in here much, but I'll say that having been on the 366-day Mars Sim, the expeditionary mindset saved the mission. We could be fighting, we could be hugging, we could be not talking, we could be out of power, food, and water. Those things all happen, only all together once, but individually all the time. And there was no way we were quitting. And we were going to put any personal issues aside because the mission came first. But I'll caveat that with 366 days later, my body walked out of a dome and my brain crawled out. I was done. I was a doctor that had been on call for a year straight, and check, please. So, if we needed to keep going, we could have. The crew could have done and would have done anything we'd needed had we been called on, but we were ready to take a break. And I don't know how we give astronauts a break yet. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. So I'll say, find that answer, please. Any of you, anyone within who can hear me in any form, please help us find that answer. Speaking of which, the next question is, how do we train a functional culture of health and safety on a mission such as this? So what are the components of the system that defined and bound reasonable risk? Those pushing envelope people who have now been put in the can and told, please don't push the envelope too much because the can might break. Who says go and no go? And when and why for taking risks or not taking risks, which we might want to do once we've managed to get there alive and get to run around and play. Let's start with Amanda.
I don't know that I really want to address the who says go and no go, because I'm for sure that is above my pay grade. But so components really. Working with the flight test environment now for a few years. Yes, they're designed to push the limits, and yes, they're designed to kind of expand the envelopes of performance of systems, but they do it very methodically, very systematically. They don't deviate from procedures unless that has been briefed. So there are ways that we kind of mitigate the risk. You'll never really remove the risk, but we mitigate the risk by trying to walk through all of the known knowns. There's always the unknowns that are going to get you, but what we do know, and we walk through it step by step, and kind of play worst case scenario, bad day, this thing breaks, what are we going to do step by step, what's it going to look like, and then we practice it. And you do that whether that's chair flying or in a simulator, and then you do it in the air. And if things don't behave as expected, if systems don't behave as anticipated, then you stop and you talk about it. You don't continue. So there's ways to kind of approach things systematically to mitigate that risk for safety reasons.
So we plan to fail a lot. And what else, Elizabeth?
I think one of the most challenging things is going to be some of the emotional weight that comes when things go wrong on a mission like this. You don't have the ground support, you don't have an exit opportunity, and there will be severe limits on resources. And so there are going to have to be very difficult decisions that are made, and those decisions that are made in regard to strictly medical issues may be challenging enough when there's not like an ICU sort of environment. How long do you prolong somebody if they're injured in a way that it is taking significant resources away from other members of the crew? But we have to consider those same challenges from a psychological perspective. And that's not something that we do particularly well today terrestrially. When do you medicate somebody? What do you do if somebody really has a true psychological break in this condition? And these are things that not only do we need to plan for and train on significantly, and for ourselves, there have to be systems that are trained on this, because we do need to be able to rely on automated systems, on AI-assisted diagnostics and care regimens, and in a crisis situation, again, in a worst-case scenario, your only kind of unbiased source is going to be some of this technology. And so, how do you build trust within this system, and how do you account for the unknown unknowns? And where is that line between following exactly what procedure has said and doing something that's unexpected? And again, I think that there will be unique challenges that come in an environment where you are traveling with a small crew for 3 years. And there is going to be a lot of emotional dynamics that come into play that make this challenging, and in a way that we haven't experienced before. Training is a huge piece of this again, but there are also different risk tolerances. And so when we talk about what that training looks like, what that procedure looks like, that's going to vary potentially between NASA, between the new space companies. What are people's personal risk profiles? All of these are things that we're going to need to account for in some way, shape, or form, and that present a lot of challenges.
Kevin, as the crew has a longer and longer lifetime delay, more and more time to think about how they would like to proceed versus adhere to the procedures, how do you continue to support having a culture of health and safety? Do you expect them to stick to the procedures, or do you plan to send humans?
Sheyna, you read my mind, because I was about to jump in and say, you don't have time to phone home the experts, right? When you're talking about 20 minutes one way, perhaps at the maximum, and something goes wrong, you got to rely on what you got in front of you, and you may not be the technical expert on the problem at hand, and you individually, who may be the one that's responsible for solving it, may have a different risk posture or a different risk tolerance or a different approach to solving the problem that may not be in line with your crewmates, as a whole. I'm just going to ask a whole bunch of rhetoricals because I don't have any answers here. But those are things we need to think about: is assembling the crew, working together, having a common understanding of risk posture, risk tolerance, and then factoring into that into the go forward plan, especially when you don't have access to the expert at a moment's notice.
Erik, what is even a culture of health and safety, and what does a functional one look like, and where can I find it?
Well, I'm the last person you should talk to about culture, but I actually want to address a couple of things that were said and focus on risk as a part of that culture. The biggest disservice that I do to Michelle Rucker back there when I was at NASA was to not be able to quantify the things that we're worried about, right? How can Hoppy or Michelle actually design something that gives adequate respect or space to the human needs if I can't tell you how much risk you're carrying if you don't actually include these things, right? That's a massive challenge. When I took over the Human System Risk Board at NASA, you know what the funding was for that? Right? We had to go fight for funding. There's a lot of funding going to specific experiments or cool gee whiz, projects, but not a lot of funding that was going towards, hey, our risk quantification approaches are inadequate. How do I tell you how much risk there is for, let's say, the big thing that came up yesterday, cancer from space radiation, right? How likely is that to happen? We have models and we have numbers for it, and we've put them out in the public. And believe it or not, when Jancy put that slide up yesterday, right, you notice that wasn't the top thing she talked about. Because when you actually step past, does anybody know what a sievert is, right? This is the number that Hoppy does, I know, but what does that mean for how much your likelihood of cancer increases, right? How many people can make that translation? So we've done those calculations with our best models, and there's uncertainty, but in all honesty, even in the worst case scenarios on a Mars mission, you're talking about adding an excess risk of dying sometime in your life from a cancer. From the worst case Mars mission scenario, the mean value is about 4% increase in chance of dying, right? You have a 12% chance of dying just because you're human from cancer. And if you're a smoker, that goes up to somewhere between 17 and 24%. So is that our biggest problem, really? Right? How often are we going to need the crew to repair the vehicle and maintain the vehicle in a situation that could kill them, right? When we're talking about when you can't get a hold of the experts, because you actually can phone home. It's a store and forward process. It actually probably unloads cognitively the crew quite a bit from dealing with mission control and probably takes some stress off. So you have a way, right? But it's delayed answers. So there's a golden hour, right? Something goes wrong. How do you figure out when that something occurred? Because right now that all happens in real time on the ISS, right? How do you figure out what occurred? How do you diagnose the problem and how do you solve it? Right? And right now that's done by 80 to 150 people in mission control who have 24/7 access to the telemetry. So if you really want me to give you an answer on how important is this, then you need to ask me the question, how likely is it to happen? What are the odds? So we went and looked over 20 years of the space station and analyzed all the IFEs and the anomalies and all those things like that. We bucketed them into the highest category of what is the thing that is most likely to kill the crew and how often does it happen if you don't have access to mission control for the first hour. 1.7 times a year throughout the ISS lifetime. And in the first 6 years, during the burn-in phase of the ISS, it was more like 3 to 4 times a year. Because when we design things, we don't make them perfectly. Things break. So maybe we're looking at 12 times that this crew potentially could have to deal with a life-threatening event in a massively complex system that they have to have the cognitive readiness to deal with as they're deconditioning, the physical readiness to deal with as they're deconditioning, right? When we talk about human performance, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night. And that's why I harp on human system integration architecture, because they can design these systems as well as they want, but every single one of us knows you're not the first person to buy the first thing on the market. You let a few people break it a few times and then go through the first recall, right? They're not going to have that plan here. So part of the buy-down risk and part of the mentality, right, of creating a safety culture is two things in my mind. One is fail often and fail early and break these things in analogs where you're not going to have those issues, right? And that requires funding to do that stuff up front, right? We have moved heavily away from testing as a means of V&V towards a lot of V&V by analysis in many places. I advocate for more testing with humans in the loop and more testing of the systems as integrated systems. And this is part of why the Moon to Mars program has the moon as part of this step, right? Science is great. I'm very much in support of it. I really don't want to kill the crew on the next step. So we have to learn there. I was going to say something else, but I got off on a rant, so I'll stop there.
Well, your rant was a helpful rant because it leads to the next question, so good job. No, I mean, that does beg the question. So Erik was just alluding to how you allocate resources in anticipation of having to solve these problems. And so the argument has been lobbied, and I think many of us would agree, you allocate them to analogs. You allocate them to a phased approach to an actual Mars mission, which includes, increasing distance, increasing duration, so that you can break stuff, because life breaks stuff, people break stuff, space breaks stuff, space breaks people, and we don't know how all those things break and how to fix them. So if we do it one step at a time, we're more likely to meet ultimate success, right? That's the argument. So then the question becomes, how do resources need to be allocated during Mars missions to maintain maximal operational readiness once you actually get there? So, Amanda, I picked on you last time. Elizabeth, do you want to go this time?
We need new ways to make things, I think is one of the core pieces of this. When we think about having to bring everything with us or find it or make it, the options become, again, a lot more limited when you're spending so much time in transit. And when you, particularly thinking about things like medication, we both need to change the way that we diagnose, and we need to change the way we manufacture a lot of drugs. And this is, obviously these are things that benefit us here terrestrially as well, but we don't have access to the same type of medical care in space. And we can't do the kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks kind of medical treatment. So we need to really become much better at understanding specific damage for specific individuals and how to treat that more effectively. And there are a lot of different disciplines that fall into this. We are seeing a lot of advances in things like synthetic bio, which has become a very substantial market in recent years and is projected to be the main driver in 3xing the size of the bioeconomy over the next couple decades. So there are people working on these problems in a lot of different ways. I think we also just need to, as much as possible, have some redundancy, both in systems and in people. And in people is the biggest challenge. The question, of course, is always what happens if the doctor gets sick. And so how do we distribute some of that knowledge and capability in a way that allows us to be successful in that environment? Is a big question.
All right, so learn more, grow as a society, solve the low-resource environment problem. That would be really helpful for a lot of things. To maintain fitness in terms of maximal operational readiness. Erik, what are your thoughts? Fitness, physical fitness, performance proficiency.
Health is a necessary but not sufficient condition for performance. Right? We need knowledge, skills, and abilities. We need training. We need a whole bunch of other things that go along with health. But health is the foundation of it. So if you want to maintain fitness, you have to figure out how to provide all of those things. When you talk about things we need to learn, I think of a couple of specific things. One is precision medicine. This is not very broadly practiced terrestrially, but we have the ability, if we send, for example, a crew of 4 people, to characterize them very well, which is not an ability that I have at Ben Taub's emergency room waiting room, right? We don't spend that kind of resources on all of our patients, but we're already spending $1 billion putting these people up there. What's another 100,000 to characterize their, longitudinal health profile? The reason why we look to do that is because in this case, we'd really like to be able to identify when a small problem is happening and intervene before it becomes a big problem, right? Especially, from the mentality of astronauts, at least the caricature of it over in the past has been they don't want to tell anybody about their medical problems because it might ground them, right? Okay, so how do we get away from that? The flight surgeons have worked a lot to get away from that over the past 20 years, but the paradigm is changing. The things that they need to do and what we need them to do are changing. And once they're off on a Mars mission, nobody's pulling them back, right? So how do we make sure that we can catch those small problems? Precision medicine is one of those capabilities that has to be developed. The other part of it is how do you make a system that can do that? And so I used to say anybody who goes onto WebMD and goes and looks for their symptoms is going to have cancer, right? Now, if you go and look on ChatGPT and ask it about your symptoms, it'll make up a reference for you for the cancer they have. That'll be completely manufactured out of thin air, right? But the advances that are happening in this domain are things that need to be harnessed, because if we're actually going to make up for that loss of 80 to 150 people at mission control, then you have to bring that capability and the usability of the data that we do collect to the crew in a way that's meaningful. And that, one of the things that NASA has not done a very good job with is data architecture and data management. They're wonderful at making rockets and stuff. At least at Johnson Space Center, we've struggled to stay with I'd say, the current trends in data stuff. I mean, at the ISS, when it was flown, these things weren't even available, right? Think about NASA operating in that bubble for 20 years on the human side of things, and how do we do that job better? Well, we got a lot to learn. We got a lot of partnering to do. So data management, data systems, and the potential for AI to partner is an augmented intelligence rather than an artificial intelligence, right? We're never going to get to a comprehensive healthcare system in one of these missions, but you want it to be an appropriately scoped healthcare system. And if you can start to figure out what that looks like, then you can enable that fitness. And then the other thing is you got to define what fitness for duty means, right? We struggle with that. What does fitness for duty mean? Does it mean you can lift 5 pounds and open the hatch? Does it mean that your cognitive function is at a certain level? Does it mean your aerobic capacity is strong enough to keep getting on the exercise? I don't know. If you think about the critical tasks and the way that we structure our systems engineering pathways, the earlier you can make a master task list, the better for us figuring out, hey, what do you have to be fit to do? Because that helps bound what do we mean by performance? What do you need to have in there so that the crew can actually do their job?
Amanda, Navy and all military and all civilian, flyers and divers get cleared to do their jobs. And then they get into the field. How do they maintain maximal operational readiness even though things happen that they weren't cleared for to do and things have changed since they've been cleared?
That's a really great question. So what I can say is that it resonated with me when Erik was talking about the kind of the process of going through, not telling your flight doc things that occur. And I mean, I've spent more than 15 years now in flight status myself with the Navy, and even as a medical professional, waited until a point was pretty critical and I was on the way to the ER to be like, oh, maybe I probably should have looked into this sooner. You insert that bias in your mind that it's going to somehow impact your go or no-go criteria, and that can be a very powerful driver for things. So, how you manage that, with a lot of trust and with a lot of ensuring that they are still able to fly, still able to do, you're not going to get a downshift because you need some physical therapy for your shoulder, or you're not going to get a downshift because, you happen to have had, whatever illness have you, but maybe scale the scope of the job that you're doing while you're recovering, and maybe you shift your focus a little more to your recovery, whether that's a physical, a mental piece of it. Trust is obviously a really big piece of that, and I don't think it's something that has really been mastered, in my opinion. So it's a really great question.
Kevin, can we build systems agile enough to be scaled when someone needs to take a duty, what we call a sort of a duty shift alteration, or be put on some sort of accommodated work schedule? They're on Mars and there's only 4 of them. There's only 6 of them. They each have a job to do. It's got to get done. Is that got to be part of it, where we can actually plan to have somebody cycle out either for mental health, physical health, or immediate need, or maybe cycle 2 out? How many should we be prepared to cycle out as needed?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sheyna, and I think what I want to do is tie that back to the discussion on risk and risk posture. As an engineer, we typically, as we're managing risk throughout a program, we assign a likelihood and a severity to a risk that we come up with, and how do we assign that likelihood and a severity? right? How much effort do we really put into, like Erik said, putting a solid number against that risk? And if we were to do that, we have probably a better way in terms of risk management. But instead, we've got a risk register that has green, yellow, and red risks, and we start tackling the red risks first, and then if money and time allow, we start to work on the yellow risks, and eventually, we get to a point where there's an acceptable level of risk that we can proceed with. Now, one thing I think also, Erik said, and it's been mentioned on the panel before about, getting integrated tests and working on, V&V activities sooner, because there are, the unknown unknowns that we talked about, and when you start assembling a system and you start testing it, you get emergent behaviors, and some of those emergent behaviors are completely outside of scope of what you would have predicted in sim, especially as the systems become, more and more complex. So, with that preamble, and going back to Sheyna's question now, when we're looking at cycling crews in and out, let's test that on the ground. Let's test that early in representative analog environments and see what kind of emergent behaviors come out of those scenarios to help us, one, identify the unknown unknowns. So now they are known unknowns, or perhaps as far as going as they're known knowns, and then put a mitigation plan and strategy in place so that we don't see them or minimize the likelihood of seeing them in the actual mission.
There was a number of things that you said there that made me think about some of the risk work that I did and for NASA, and that was the biggest challenge, was how are we going to, I had to rewrite all of the procedures for likelihood and consequence and how we go about them when I was there. And there wasn't, most people when they hear the word risk management either think something deep in engineering or like financial institutions, right? And so when we talk about human system risk management, it's a stretch for people's imagination, right? And in part because nailing down those numbers is so hard, partially from biological variability in this case. That's a huge problem. For as much as Michelle wants me to tell her exactly how much these problems are going to be, the error bars are pretty wide either way. And even in low Earth orbit, right, we see bone loss in our astronauts that ranges from like minus 24% of their initial up to positive 2 or 3%, because some of them are really good with working out, over varieties of missions. So it's a pretty wide range of uncertainty. And so how we deal with uncertainty in the human aspect is part of why, precision medicine and other things like that. I think that actually the place where we do malpractice and risk is in the unknown knowns. We have a complex system. There's a whole bunch of things that we probably have data on if we were smart enough to tie them together, right? And this is the problem with humans. By the red, yellow, green system, we don't have any problems with sleep and space flight, right? We also don't have any problems with muscle strength, aerobic fitness. There's a whole bunch of things there that we've kind of chalked up to, we know how to do this because we did it on the space station. Well, then the operational paradigm changes. But guess what's getting the most money? It's not something like sleep. Historically, it's not been food, which is probably one of the biggest problems. It's not been human system integration challenges. Like historically, a huge amount of this has gone to radiation, right? And it's a big problem, but there's a lot of big problems. And so from that perspective, that's some of the biggest things we struggle with. And when we talk about quantification, NASA spent 9 years developing the integrated medical model, right? Probabilistic risk assessment in the medical domain. There's nothing else like it. And it's a model. It's wrong, right? But does it get us in the ballpark? Reasonably. It's not going to be perfect. And they're working on improving that and doing a better job with it. But until we come up with new ways to actually map system complexity and map it to risk, we really struggle in that area of emergent behavior, right? And the only way to do that, if you don't have the model to do that, is breaking things a whole lot out in the field.
All models are wrong, but some are useful.
All models are wrong, but some are useful. Amanda, as a physiologist, do we have any reasonable models that we can work with now, and can we break them to make them work better?
Oh, there are a lot of models that exist that are pieces for human performance. So one of the things that even now, even after congressional level attention for 5 years, one of the things that we are still struggling with is instrumenting the human in deciding what data we want to capture, and then once we have that data, what are we going to do with it? And it's all kind of related when you talk about the trust in the flight surgeon for go and no-go criteria. Is the human even going to let you instrument them if they think that you're going to tell them that they can't fly or they can't do the mission? So we're dealing with that, at least in naval aviation. And then from there, so you instrument the human and you find a device that's reliable, and you plug the data into a model, and it gives you some limited information based on what we know and what's been put into that model. But collectively, like as Erik already kind of said, that there's just a lot of variability there for a human. You have these thresholds, and you could trip a threshold that could cause some type of physiological event to happen one day, and then in the same exact human, in the same exact conditions, you won't trip that threshold and you won't cause that physiological event. So there's just so much variability that you have to work with, and so there's instrumenting, there's plugging the data into the model, but then there's still so much that we don't know, and those models aren't complete.
All right, this is the last planned question we're going to get to before your unplanned questions come at us. So please get those questions ready. And this last one, if you take everything that's been said so far, and we build the model of our dreams based on breaking models for years in analog, and on the lunar surface, and in cislunar space, we've taken the models, we've broken the models, we fixed the models, we remade the models, we broke those, we fixed them, okay. Now the models seem to lie, reasonably few times, okay. Enough that we feel more comfortable. And your human has gone to Mars, they've made it there, but they seem to be under a little bit of stress. We want to cycle them out for a few days, give them a vacay. And they say, no, I don't wanna. This leads into the question of, what interventions do you choose to maintain human health and safety in scenarios like this, by which I mean where and how and with what do you choose to intervene when you think somebody might be approaching an unsafe situation? They're on Mars. There's a lifetime delay. How do we intervene to maintain human health during this mission in these scenarios?
Amanda, you're a parent.
Yeah.
Safety gates, deploy.
Yeah. So I mean, there's things you can do. You can make it part of the routine, part of the schedule, so that it takes the onus off of the individual to say, you need this break, and then they have to kind of have a moment, an internal moment where they're like, oh, am I weak? And am I breaking? Is something wrong? Well, if it's scheduled, then you take that onus off of them. So there's that piece of it, but then there's still the instance where someone might need something unscheduled. And again, that just kind of goes back to being able to have those conversations and being able to trust somebody. Maybe it's you see some red flags as a part of their healthcare team, and then you open up the conversation with that person and you ask them questions, and maybe they are okay to go. It just kind of is going to depend on what they're feeling, what their perception of things are. Perception is not always reality. So having those conversations and trying to lead them to, well, this is what I see. What are you seeing? Let's talk about that. So even in those unscheduled, unroutine type of needing a break scenarios, there's still a way to kind of gently massage the ego, if you will, so that they can take that without having to be perceived as being weak.
when people are put on light duty when they're on the big boats? How do they take it? This is a true curiosity point. I don't know, because I'm a flight surgeon, not a
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of variety there. So you can get people that are like, fine, I'm broken and I need some time to heal. You can get people that are like, well, I'm not just gonna sit here, fly me off the boat then, I'm done. And then it really kind of depends on, as the healthcare team, how you're approaching it. If you say, hey, maybe you can't do this physical task because whatever, your shoulder, your legs, whatever happens to need some recovery time, but you could still really help the team by doing this task. And so that's going back to having that expeditionary mindset where you're still valuable to the team, you're still a member of the team, you're still carrying some weight, but maybe you're just doing something a little different until you're able to get back to, whatever the criteria is, the 80% go criteria, 100%, whatever your threshold is.
Elizabeth, how would you choose to intervene, and with what and why?
Well, again, I think part of this really comes back to the need to have technology to support some of this. There needs to be some sort of unbiased guidance. And, when we talk about humans not wanting to be tested, about lying about symptoms, these are all things that everybody does to some degree. And I think for missions like this, when losing one member of the crew, it really does harm the overall success of the mission. If they're not able to participate, we need to remove the opt-in for a lot of the medical monitoring and testing. There need to be passive systems that continually monitor some baseline function, and that can be, again, both physical and mental. And mental health is, I think, still the biggest challenge here. When we talk about, people wanting to hide physical symptoms, that's going to be even more likely with physiological or psychological distress. And partly that is, a product of the culture that we all live in today, and partly that is just the fact that we may not be aware of the fact that something is wrong. And so there needs to be, as part of that routine, some of these systems are being developed today that are, that include things like games, right? Like a gamification of tests that assess cognitive function. We probably all saw the research out of Texas that made a bunch of exciting headlines about the GPT-esque model that worked alongside fMRIs to effectively read people's thoughts to some degree. I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of question to talk about that type of monitoring on a regular basis so that we can be proactive in identifying risk across all of these areas. But again, this comes back to kind of how much room we have to be human, and how much trust we have in the systems that are around us.
So after 4 or 5 months in sim, my crew decided to take one day a month off, first Sunday of every month. And half the crew spent it in the lab catching up on work, because astronauts. I spent it in my bunk doing absolutely nothing I didn't have to, but I was in the minority there. Kevin, let's say we have the system of our dreams, we can read intentions, see things coming. They want to spend that day in the lab. They do. It brings them joy. You talked about meaningful work. But really, we can see a problem coming. How and where and why do you choose to intervene, and with what?
Yeah. So I wanted to, bring it back to, some of the conversation that was just a moment ago about, coming down to kind of a design philosophy. Is it a Boeing or is it an Airbus? Mm-hmm. Who has the final final say in the control authority of the vehicle, right? Airbus puts the guardrails on the flight control system, whereas Boeing will let you do whatever you want to do to fly that vehicle. Now, historically and currently, NASA's human rating requirements say that the pilots have the final control authority of the vehicle in terms of flight path and attitude. They can do whatever they want. Now, okay, so let's now talk about characterizing the risk associated with flying the vehicle from whatever orbit you're in to the surface, right? For Apollo, it wasn't so much of an issue because they spent about 3 days in microgravity before they descended to the lunar surface, right? If that vehicle were to be flown completely automatically, there was about an 8 to 12% chance of an unsuccessful landing just because of unknown underlying terrain. And the astronauts on board were able to recognize that, divert the craft, and land successfully 6 times. Now, fast forward to Gateway, we're spending 30 days, potentially 30 days in microgravity, and now we're going to ask the astronauts to now go from, probably mostly deconditioned, and take control of the vehicle while flying in a partial gravity environment down to the lunar surface, 16G, okay? What's the risk associated with that? How's that going to affect sensory motor manual control performance? Fast forward to Mars. Okay, now we spent 6 months or a year in microgravity. Maybe we've been spinning around in a centrifuge or something else to help us stay partially conditioned. And now we're heading down into 3/8G. And we got to pilot a spacecraft, not through an airless environment, but now through an atmospheric environment, which has aerodynamic disturbances and all that other stuff that goes along with it. What's the risk associated with that? I don't know. But these are, I think, important questions that we need to ask along the way and characterize before we can make an informed decision in terms of what the risk posture is for who has final authority in piloting that spacecraft to the surface.
So I think, Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that Mars entry has a piloted option. Is that still on the table?
No decisions have been made. Things will be happening very, very fast.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than the moon. All right, so what happened at the moon? 6 landings, and 6 times the crew took over from the automated computer. If you found Neil Armstrong's talk online where he talks about what happened, what alarms went off, it's fascinating. I got to hear it in person. I was very lucky. And then there's the question of, did they need to do it every single time? I don't know. They did, right? The cosmonauts had a lot of automated things, but they also make an extra, I don't know, how many $1,000 if they actually manually pilot a vehicle. So there's an incentive in that process. And the other part of that is that if you look at what happened with the Progress vehicle that crashed into the Mir space station, right? That was under piloting, remote piloting, with a lot of things that were happening around it at the time. And there's you can go find out more about that event, go read Dragonfly or something like that. But these are not theoretical concerns, right? These are things that have happened. So mission-critical tasks and what the definition of them is and what does it mean to be fit to do these things is a critical part of understanding that risk. But at the same time, through a 2-year, 3-year Mars mission, right, do they have to be 100% the whole 2 to 3 years? No. You got to make sure that they're ready when they got to do these specific jobs. And then you got to also give them the leeway to have that downtime. But here's the thing, and this is what I think we struggle with when we focus so much on the engineering problems and less on the human problems, is that this is a culture thing. When we talk about culture at this conference, right? I used to give a talk on Antarctica, the Antarctic missions, and Robert Falcon Scott and Amundsen, who raced to the South Pole in 1911. And one of them sat there for like 6 months beforehand and tested everything out in the environment and designed and redesigned, and then they, did a whole bunch of specific things. And the other group, let's say they had a very machismo attitude. I show a picture, I should have put some slides together for this, but I show a picture of man-hauling that they used to do down in Antarctica, where you got like 4 dudes on skis in front of this gigantic block of supplies on a sled, and they're all pulling away, and they're like, this is manly, right? And it's like, that's the team that died, right? How we frame our expectations about what we're expecting people to do, how we're expecting them to interact, how we frame things like that machismo versus what does it really mean to be part of a team, to be a leader and a follower, to actually put the team first. That's a culture question. And that's something that gets developed in other places than the engineering lab, right? So that's a part of why things like analogs like HERA, where they're testing out the behavioral stuff, are so important, right? We get insight into that. We start to put some bounds on that uncertainty a little bit. And then maybe I can get Michelle and Hoppy some better numbers. I don't know. Probably not. They're probably still not going to be happy with me. But that's, it is about the human aspect. It is about the human culture that we give to the crew, that they carry with them, and that they develop as we struggle with behavioral and team type risks. And if you don't do that, well, I got a picture of manholing to show you.
Well, speaking of framing, who would like to come up and frame a question about all this? We've talked a lot about some, yes, high-level stuff. Please, come in, bring it in. Go ahead. And when you step up, please say your name.
Hoppy Price, JPL. And I heard a lot of talk about variability in physiology and psychological performance. And I know from talking to astronauts that there's a great difference between how long it takes astronauts to readapt to being on the ground after being in space for months and months. How valuable will screening be in selecting the crew that really goes to Mars? How effective is that? And how much screening is actually acceptable culturally to NASA to try to maximize the success of the mission?
Well, screening is very acceptable to NASA, at least historically. I mean, they've got the most draconian selection requirements of anything on the planet. It's the only job I ever applied for that I got a colonoscopy out of the interview. So, you got to keep that in mind. Historically, the way that NASA has brought down risk is through screening and through draconian selection. And so the problem then becomes, how long does that risk stay brought down in these missions? So our best calculations suggest that somewhere between 40 and 180 days, you really lose the benefits of that extreme selection. Like if we weren't to send any medical stuff at all, then the fact that they're human and medical things happen just starts to assert itself. Can I tell you that with any better certainty? No, but definitely at 3 years, if you haven't sent this right stuff to keep them, keep them going, you're in that place. So this comes back to that question of how do we build in the system, right? The system is what makes up for that when the screening is now overcome by events. And I think one of the biggest things that we've struggled with is that we've been very lucky in low Earth orbit. And, to have all the advantages we do, right? Real-time comm for all that support, consumables resupply that is pretty reliable and pretty speedy comparatively, the ability to evacuate if we wanted to, right, at a variety of speeds. And a lot of those things give comfort to feeling like, okay, our screening and all these things, you take those away, and now what's the role of screening? Well, I'm not sure, but I know that it's not enough, right? I know you're not going to be able to select your way out of the risk as we have done before. Is that fair?
Yeah, but I'm just thinking of buying down some of the risk, maybe even a fair amount of the risk.
I think the biggest portion of screening on this is actually the psychological testing, right? And the markers that are in the literature for this are really who can be the best team players. Right? I mean, that is so far. You can train people to do everything else, but.
Amanda, any other comments about screening, physiologic screening, psychological screening, and where the benefits of those screening taper off or fall down?
I'll just add that what I don't know is if someone who is very successful on the ISS would be successful on a Mars mission. And so if we're going to talk about screening, we don't know if we're looking for the same characteristics or exactly, again, who will be successful in that sort of environment. And I think that's a big question.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with everything that has been said. So essentially, looking at screening is just, that's a tough pill to swallow, because when you're talking about whether or not somebody is at risk for being able to do that, or how much risk is there for them to be able to successfully do the job, physiologically, it hasn't been quantified, and so that is, and there's so much variability as mentioned. So I fully agree with Erik when he says that the biggest thing that you should be screening for is behavioral and team dynamics and those nature type things. What I would also say is that we have all these mental models, people with PhDs, way bigger brains than I have, but they've built these mental models on things like situational awareness and severity, I'm sorry, not severity, whether or not something has been recent in the mind, so recency, those types of things. So when we talk about training, well, if they haven't seen it for 180 days because they trained on it before they launched, then how we can say that they're proficient at it. They got the check in the box for the training, but how much of that do they remember? And so we go through this in the Navy too, with people going back and forth on, you only do the emergency egress from the helo dunker every 4 years. If I crash my helo at 3.5 years, I'm proficient according to everything in my record, but am I going to remember all that stuff that I did 3.5 years ago? So it's always kind of this gray area of what the mind's going to retain and what you need to train them on, and so the behavioral health and the mental health aspect of that is critical.
Maybe have decided you will survive that crash.
Kevin, anything to add before we go to the next question?
Pass.
You're up, sir.
Hi, my name is Abdul Mohsen. I'm a grad student at GW. I just have 2 quick questions. How do you see 3D printing affecting building medical equipment on Mars? Also, I heard a lot about muscle density loss, but how would you combat the bone density, the loss of bone density?
Can we start with the 3D printing, and Kevin, if you have anything to add?
I can't speak to 3D printing of medical equipment, but just in terms of having a 3D printer for other equipment, yes. Really important. Really important.
Go. I think in any of these missions, the concept of 3D printing is one of those technologies like precision medicine and AI that as it matures, it's going to solve a lot of problems, potentially, as long as we invest in understanding the pluses and minuses within the environment that we're working with it, right? So they've had Made in Space up on the space station for a while. They printed some pizza and some other things, and they've even sent up and printed like certain tools that the astronauts have needed. And when you think about trying to bring medical capability, the ability to, let's say you didn't plan to bring a tool that you needed because it was a low likelihood thing, and then, that thing happens, and, most of the medical events, let's be honest, most medical events, even in my emergency department, are not actually emergencies, right? So oftentimes, especially at busy places, people with medical issues will wait in my waiting room, hours, right? So you probably have the time to say, what can we do about this? There are some events, but you got to be realistic about this. You have the time to print out a thing, maybe, and use that. Now, do you want your speculum to be the thing that you print out if you haven't actually tried it and somebody's not going to, how's it going to work, and, is it sharp on the edge? Nobody wants to do that for the first time in flight, right? So you can't just rely on the fact that you have a CAD model and some 3D printing materials. This is one of those things that has to be tried out, again, in analogs and other places, and refined in order to actually be something that doesn't cause more problems than it solves. Does that make sense? What was the second question? Sorry.
Bone density and muscle density.
Oh, bone density and muscle density. So the ISS has 3 types of exercise on it right now: a cycloergometer, a running treadmill, and the ARED, which is a weightlifting machine that doesn't have any weights. You push against like a vacuum. When we do the resistive exercise work, that tends to strengthen the large muscles that are doing that, but one of the areas that it struggles with is less like postural muscles or other things like that are, less used for specific exercise. It is more used just in the keeping your body upright from gravity down here. And so when astronauts come back, a lot of times those muscles are underdeveloped compared to, like, your biceps, your triceps, your, all that sort of stuff, your glutes and your squats and all that sort of stuff. Those things, for most astronauts, if they're doing the exercise regimen, you can significantly slow down both on the bone side and the muscle side. It's not perfect, but there's a significant advantage to that, right? And so the other things that we look at in terms of bone are, should we use medications, right? And we struggle with that a little bit. One of the recommendations from one of the RRCs that came in for bone health was to consider using zolendronate, which is an IV bisphosphonate that can be given. And there's some pluses and minuses to this, right? It can help with stymieing the release of calcium from bones, but it also can make your bones brittle in certain places and stuff like that. And so these questions are still some of the things that we struggle with. How, do you use some of these things that could potentially cause more problems than we solve? And that's a lot of what Jancy and the Human Research Program are struggling with kind of on a regular basis is, they've done a lot of research into bone and muscle stuff over the years, and we still don't have the perfect answers for this, but this is why it keeps getting funded.
And Elizabeth mentioned medications and medication stability over time, even if we want people on meds or supplements, which they take now, calcium and whatnot. How do we keep that stable over the course of a mission? It's not known. Amanda, Elizabeth, anything to add about 3D printing bone and muscle?
Can I add one thing to that on the medication front? So pharmaceuticals, this is a thing that NASA has not spent a lot of money trying to figure out, believe it or not. And the reason why is because it hasn't been a major problem in low Earth orbit. We've been able to resupply them, and they also repackage them for volume and mass considerations, right? Or repackage a lot of them. And so this is an area that there's two sides to it, right? Are the medications going to degrade? And we saw some of that in the experiments that they did on the shuttle. They kept them up there for 880 days, a bunch of different medications, and some of them degraded a lot faster than their ground controls. But why was still an open question. We just had a great publication that just came out from EXMC that analyzed some of that data and said, you know what, it probably was actually the repackaging. We've struggled, right? Is it the radiation environment? Is it? But they think it was actually the repackaging. So we are learning, right? We are actually making progress in these domains. But the thing we haven't figured out is when you go up there and all your physiology changes and your fluids redistribute and your digestion slows down and all these things happen, how does that affect your pharmacokinetics and your pharmacodynamics? No idea.
I read one paper on it. They did a comparison study from ground to ISS with paracetamol, Tylenol absorption, comparing up there and down there, and there were huge differences. And we still don't quite know why. About it's the kinetics of the drug itself, about the changes in the person's lean muscle mass and fat and their own metabolism. But yeah, it's not been well studied or characterized.
Mike Hilton, I'm a retired aerospace engineer. A couple of comments and a suggestion. First of all, I think each one of you have a great mindset on the way to go and different paths to follow to improve and get a successful crew to go to Mars. I congratulate all of you on that. Second comment is for Erik. Indicated a little while ago that the astronauts have to be able to perform at 100% for critical times when they have to do a critical job. But I would suggest that every astronaut has to be able to come out of sleep or whatever and perform at 100% performance during an emergency, and I'm sure they know that, and you know that. So
interestingly, NASA has actually studied and published on the personal profiles of responses for sleep inertia to Ambien and to Lunesta and to things like that, because they've been trying to figure out what the right doses are on a person-by-person basis to make sure that when they're waking up, that they don't have too much sleep inertia and that they can respond to alarms and things like that. So there's actually been, we take that quite seriously, and there's been a fair amount of research done at least trying to characterize that part of it for exactly the reason that you're saying.
Right. I always think of Apollo 13. And the suggestion is, I'm surprised NASA doesn't have some kind of a program that can study psychology in long-term missions. For example, a 60-day mission with 4 or 6 simulated astronauts can have different kind of experiments, like 2 astronauts can play checkers every day, every single day for 60 days, and they could tell you whether that improves their psychology or not, or degrades their psychology. Or another experiment could be they could pedal a bicycle and play chess at the same time with different players to see how that affects their psychology, and they can tell you that on a scale from 1 to 10 maybe. I'm no psychologist, so I can't really tell you how to measure that, but I'm sure they could tell you whether it improves or degrades their psychology. And they could have many different experiments and combinations of experiments with mental activity and physical activity to find out how that affects their psychology. And that affects their teamwork and everything else. I'm surprised NASA doesn't have something like that going on or plan to go on.
So let me put in a plug for the Human Research Program and their HERA campaigns. So Jancy here can actually talk to you about that in more depth than I can, but NASA's actually had that program going on for a while. So HERA is the Human Exploration Research Analog, and most of the missions actually they go from, I don't remember what the shortest was, but now they're at 45-day campaigns, right? 45 days, and there's a significant amount of behavioral health research, cognitive function research that goes into those, and team research for exactly the reasons that you're talking about, right? Is that these are things that we should be testing out, and I think that's been very high on their list for a while. I think the challenge is they haven't done great at getting the whole public to really appreciate the amount of work that's actually gone into these domains. There's a huge amount of research that's come out of the Human Research Program since it was created, and a lot of what we know about the behavioral and team things is based on exactly what you're talking about, those types of analogs that it's almost like stealth science, you know? Not everybody knows that these things are happening.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll talk to Jancy. Is that her name, Jancy? Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else any comments or questions about that before we go? All right.
All the information is great. I'm Mike Chapman with NASA Goddard, and let's see, one of the big things that came to mind from the previous discussions was pretty much the long-term effects as far as preparing crews and let's see, some of the other effects as far as the kind of physiology that's involved. And of course, I worked in safety in the Air Force. So again, as far as risk assessment, frequency versus severity, that kind of thing, I know it has to be a huge issue as far as how you have to assess that. But just on the simple, just pretty much morphing into more simple questions, since everything has already been addressed as far as a physiology, or the high level view anyway, is let's say the exercise that's required at this point as far as bone density, smooth muscle, and right now it's 2 hours, and you hear that a lot. So that's pretty much a hard metric that you hear, and would that really change in the midterm, in the mid-time, as far as going to the moon? Not so much the low Earth orbit, that's easy, but as far as going to the moon and projections going to Mars, will that be pretty much a criteria that has already been considered as far as a metric? And also as far as how you feel you're getting ahead of that message for our civilian astronauts, because that's something that we don't hear too much, but if, I guess, Elon had his way, they would be on the ship and they're on their way. Have no idea how much they have to exercise just to maintain that. So,
clarification, when you say the 2 hours, are you referring to the amount of time that the crew spend on the ISS on a daily basis?
Yes.
All right, so they're allotted like 2.5 hours, and a good chunk of that is setup and breakdown of the equipment. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually a full 2.5 hours of exercise time.
Quality exercise comes down to...
So yeah, it's as advertised, it includes kind of those things on both ends, right? Yeah. I don't know what the actual total amount is in a given session, but it's not 2.5 hours.
Or even an hour
and
for a regular person.
The way we learned this, like the very first time we saw this was like in 1971, and Alexei Leonov was looking at the cosmonauts that were coming back from the first 2-week mission, and he said they couldn't even carry their helmets out of the vehicle, right? Yeah. So maybe the commercial people learn this the same way that we learned it in the beginning.
Gotcha.
Maybe they just go and do it, and their people are deconditioned. That's an acceptable way to do it as long as you're ready to accept the risk.
Right.
Or you could learn from the mistakes we've made along the way, or the things that we've, found out by continuously challenging ourselves. I think, SpaceX and a lot of the other groups that are getting NASA money, they have an incentive to start to meet the human system requirements, right? The 3001 standards, because not only is it the combined knowledge of what we learned over 60 years of space flight about how do you keep the humans safe, but it's also going to reduce their liability significantly. And so they have an interest in trying to make sure that they keep a happy and healthy population flying, because they don't want somebody who's going to go back and say, well, I went to space and it was great for like 3 weeks, but then it took me 3 months to recover, So I think they have an interest in that.
Right. No, I figured just at least the follow-on would be that the laws of supply and demand kind of filters that a little bit, so they're not so quick to send as many, and they'll have that time to actually learn through experiences. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, let me put it this way. When Elon Musk says he's going to put 100 people on Starship to go to these places, the first thing Grant Anderson asks is, where are the bathrooms and how big are they? Right? Pressurized volume does not equal net habitable volume.
Right.
And so there's a lot more that goes into it than just the space for those people to crowd into, a container.
All right, we're pushing our time here. There are other places people need to be and want to be. Can we make this very, very quick, my friends?
Yes or no?
Yes.
Quick question. On the system side, one of our key metrics for risk is LOC-LOM, right? Loss emission measure. How much, if any, work has been done in integrating human as a system into LOC-LOM calculations? And if so, is that even a major factor? Because I haven't seen LOC-LOM, the human system represented in LOC-LOM.
Yes, and I can send you all of the references on that, and half of it is the stuff that I rewrote when I was running the risk board.
All right, cool, thanks.
Anyone else have anything to say about that? No, all right.
So I have 2 questions, but they can be answered together. So the first one, in regard to the need for failure in various aspects and areas, as you mentioned, like we have to fail a lot and early, including health. How well prepared are the current analog missions that are being conducted? And the second question is, what do you believe should be the outcome of a training out of these analogs? Is it a mindset developed after participating in such analogs, or an acquisition of a practical skills considered the limitless of potential failure? It's like, what is the potential?
A question for me. Why is it a question for me, Erik?
As an analog astronaut.
As an analog astronaut. So I can say that in Hera, they yelled at us a lot as if we'd made a mistake to see what we would do. And they frustrated us intentionally. And my crew was very strong, so we just kind of went, hey, there's a 5-minute time delay each way, which gives us a lot of time to make faces at you. There was 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and then it retracted. There is a mindset going in, it's expeditionary. There is a mindset going in, it's agile. There is a mindset going in, it's we have to trust the system. We also maintain a grain of salt, sliver of doubt about the system at all times. And then your mind changes a ton. But what you learn not to do is doubt your crew, and you learn not to doubt yourself. And between those two things, you make it through. Because those stuff breaks and systems break, you staunchly refuse to. That is one of the things about the astronaut type, but it's also a terrible risk. It's a terrible, terrible risk that you face as well, because it's healthy to doubt yourself. And there's times when you do have to doubt and question leadership, and even the way that your dynamics are working. And we don't know how to do that healthily. How do you fight in a healthy way? And it's part of our organization. You have to form, storm, norm, and then you perform, you transform. We're not good at doing that yet in any organization, but certainly not in a space organization, because it will be some kind of admission of failure. Some of the stuff you don't want to tell your flight surgeon about is that we have to fight. as if it's an imperfection in the system. I think perfecting the art of fighting better and using that to transform yourself in a healthy way is going to be a major boon to all organizations. But I think the space can help lead the way there, where we get frustrated, intentionally or accidentally, because stuff is breaking, intentionally or accidentally, in analog, in sim. And then they're like, okay, fight it out, now go. Anything else to add to that?
Just something to kind of add on to that is that, and it has been mentioned already, just the personal acceptance of risk and how wildly different that can be within the crew. So the kind of person that's going to volunteer for a mission like this has probably already thought about the type of personal risk that goes into something like that and what they're willing to give in support of that mission. And so there's just I don't want to say it's a disconnect. It's not a disconnect. It's just a difference in opinions on what that risk looks like. And so, we definitely have a duty to keep them as healthy and safe as we can. But ultimately, the type of people that volunteer to do this, they're aware of the ultimate risk.
Hopefully they don't run toward it. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we can have some questions up here if you still have questions to ask us. Take care.